So the next day I went to the doctor, who wasn't much help. I think things have changed a lot in the interim. He was, I think, fair to say, a different generation. And I broke down again in his office. And the phrase he used was, "I can see you're a bit down in the dumps. You just need to sleep." And he prescribed me sleeping tablets and sent me off. So yeah, so I went home and kind of stared at the walls for a bit, and then worked out I needed to take control of stuff myself because no one else was going to fix it. So kind of applied that problem solving to my own approach to stuff.
Hello and welcome back to Exploring Emotional Overdraft. I think we can have a good one this time. I think we can have a good one. Not only because my guest is a fellow Brighton and Hove Albion fan, which in my eyes makes him infallible, but because he's also believes in telling stories and believes in, as he said to me, owning up to the fact that you're struggling. And I love that phrase. So today I'm talking to Steve George. And Steve is the head of learning at the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, having spent much of his career prior to this as a consultant working on learning projects for some of the world's leading brands. He's passionate about mental health and well-being, and with a background in psychology, Steve is a chartered member of the CIPD, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and a graduate member of the British Psychological Society. Steve co-authored the book Adjacent Learning, published in February 2023. So nothing intimidating about that at all.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
Steve, welcome. Before we get much further into it, could you just share a little bit about who you are and what you do and how you got here?
Sure. So as you said, my name is Steve George. I'm head of learning at the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. But the context that I'm here isn't in that role. The context I'm here is that I read your book, absolutely loved it, and found that the situations you described resonated very strongly with my own experience of 12, 13 years ago, and having really a burnout-induced breakdown. And just thought, coming along to tell my story, I think as men, we're not necessarily encouraged or aren't given permission to tell our stories so much. And if I can come along and tell my story and perhaps destigmatize things a little bit for some other people, that might be helpful.
Fantastic. That's exactly what we want on this podcast. So you're in the right place, and really appreciate it. And just for anyone listening who doesn't know what an emotional overdraft is, or just so you understand how I define it for the purposes of this conversation, an emotional overdraft is when you subsidize the success of your business or your enterprise at the cost of your own mental or physical well-being. So I'll say it again, it's where you subsidize the success of your organization or your enterprise at the cost of your own mental or physical well-being. And when Steve just referred to burnout there, or burnout-induced breakdown, that's where emotional overdraft can go. So I talk about the currency of an emotional overdraft being your resilience. And the longer and deeper you stay in your emotional overdraft, the lower your resilience becomes, the less able you are to bounce back, the lower your impact becomes. And it can lead to some very uncomfortable and dark places. So we talk about, you'll hear phrases like burnout, overwhelm, anxiety, depression, these sorts of phrases. And that's where, if you're constantly subsidizing what do you do at your own cost, if the answer is always Steve, then that's how you can start to build up an emotional overdraft. So just to contextualize that. And I mentioned Brighton and Hove Albion, which is enough of a burden for anyone to carry. I have to say, it's not, we're not one of those, let's support Man United because everybody does people. But the strange thing about how we got talking about this was on a football chat room where I'd mentioned my book. You got hold of a copy and then shared your story with me, which I think was really interesting. What on earth made you reach out to someone who you'd never met before? My username on North Stand Chat, which is where we met, is couldn't be hippier, which is the name of one of our failed managers. So I'm just a sort of nameless, faceless individual. And you shared a really moving story with me. What in the first place, what made you think, to do that?
So it was having read the book and just feeling the resonance. So some of the ways that you describe things very much echoed with my own experience. And I think when you find those echoes in life, it's really important to connect with them. And for me, it's partly recognizing my own experience in the way that you describe things. I think is quite important for me as part of that ongoing healing process and ongoing recognition process. But also, I think having written a book as well, there's some validation when someone reaches out and says, I read this and found it helpful. So it's also kind of seeing a bit of that as well.
Oh, that was very kind of you, and I do appreciate it. So if you are happy to, would you like to share the story you shared with me?
Yeah. So this was before I was working at CIPD. So this was in a previous role. And I was working creating learning solutions for different organizations. And we had one particular project which I hadn't been involved with, but was going a bit wrong. And there's no blame in the way that it was going wrong. There was a mismatch between what the client expectation was and what it was technically possible to deliver. I'd had success in working with challenging customers before, so I was asked if I could take over this project and just see it through to completion. At the point I took over the project, I would have described myself, I'm sure, as resilient, as having good mental strength, as pretty confident. And I started off by devising a new solution that could be delivered within budget, would actually get closer to meeting the customer outcomes than the original solution. Shared it with the customer, set up the first meeting to talk it through, feeling really positive that we could get to a win-win with goodwill on either side, and it would work. And I went into the first meeting with them, and it was before there was video conferencing, so it was just telephone conference, just voices on my phone. And I introduced myself and just said, "Would you mind if I recorded this? Because I'm sat here on my own, or just to make sure I capture everything that I need to catch." And there was silence for a couple of beats, and then a different voice came on from the project lead. And they were the head of legal for this company, and they had 5 or 6 people in the room. They brought in all the big guns, and they had absolutely no intent of compromise. So I was immediately felt on the back of it, and from there it went downhill over the next couple of months. We would catch up every couple of days. Every couple of days, I'd feel newly beaten down. I would communicate with them daily over email, and then the next day I'd come in and I would see more critical comments coming from them on email. And I was simultaneously running other projects. And I think it might be something you say in the book, Andy, about how stress compounds. When you start making mistakes, they compound as well, because then you're trying to fix the mistakes that you've already made. And I dropped the ball in one of the other projects, so then that escalated as well. And I got to the point where I was where I didn't want to check email, because I knew every time I checked email, there'd be something else, some other kind of stress trigger going. At the same time, I have my young daughter at home, and I've always been a really present father. So, and I started to feel that getting impacted, and that's still one of my stress triggers now, is if I feel I'm not present. And it all just kept escalating and escalating and escalating. And it's worth saying my boss was actually fantastic during this time, so there's no problem with lack of support. The problem was with me not recognizing the support was there when I needed it, or not being able to ask for it, or not feeling like I could ask for it, because I'd look at the workload everyone else having, the stress they were under. So always that feeling of it's on me to solve, so I can solve this problem. And then one morning I woke up, my whole body was just shaking, and I couldn't stop it shaking. And I thought, if I just check my emails, just get over that hurdle, check my emails, see what's coming overnight, and I'll get through that, and then I can go to work. And I physically couldn't open my laptop to check my emails because I was trembling so much. And again, I know this is something that your other guests have spoken about. I had the uncontrollable tears for a good hour and a half. My wife messaged my boss to say I wouldn't be going to work, and that I would try and ring later in the day. I told my wife I was fine, not to worry. So she took my daughter to nursery, or possibly primary school at that point. And then she went to work. And I just sat and cried for another couple of hours. Couldn't speak to my boss in the afternoon. Again, she was fantastic. This was probably mid-November, early November of the year it happened. And she said, don't come back to January, just get yourself to the doctor, get yourself sorted out, don't worry about work. I'll sort that. So the next day I went to the doctor, who wasn't much help. I think things have changed a lot in the interim. He was, I think, fair to say, a different generation. And I broke down again in his office. And the phrase he used was, I can see you're a bit down in the dumps. You just need to sleep. And he prescribed me sleeping tablets and sent me off. So I went home and kind of stared at the walls for a bit, and then worked out I needed to take control of stuff myself because no one else was going to fix it. So kind of applied that problem solving to my own approach to stuff.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And it's so important that we can talk about this and that we can share it. But it's still brave, if I can call it that. I think it's still generous, certainly, to do that. So thank you, Steve. Really, thank you. There's some really interesting things you said in there, and I was trying to listen, so I didn't want to scribble down too many things. And I always say this at the end of this podcast is listen to it and then go back and maybe listen to it again, because there's a load more to pick out, like good stories. But you said you looked at others' workloads and felt that you couldn't hand it on to them. I hear that all the time. I hear people say that all the time, that they're busy, so I can't ask other people to help, so I'm going to take it on. What can you describe how you were feeling when you were looking around and you felt that was what was the feeling that you were dealing with at that time?
So I think there's a feeling of duty, definitely, that this has been given to me to do. So I'm going to make sure I do it. A feeling of not wanting to add to other people's workload and other people's stress. So knowing what stresses they're under. There's definitely a bit of ego at play that I'd say what wasn't helpful. That if I can't do this, will I be trusted again? And that also feeds into what I was saying. The support was there. I just didn't ask for it at the times I needed it, or necessarily recognize that I needed it. Which again comes into that feeling of wanting to show capability. And that almost becomes a double-edged sword, because certainly for the first couple of years after I'd had that experience, I almost put myself back in it. I wanted to prove that it wouldn't happen again. So you almost feel that double imperative to work hard to prove you can do stuff and not ask for help, because you want to show that you are capable, and that was a one-off and you're not weak in inverted commas.
Weak is the word that was in my mind as well. That's bandied around. And bearing in mind this was over a decade ago, that there probably wasn't the same language, there wasn't the same sensitivity to we hadn't gone through lockdown, obviously, which I think has raised a certain amount of, is creating new problems, but also given us a different understanding about what's going on here. And the isolation has meant that we found words for these kind of things more than we did.
I think that's fair, yeah.
And I think a doctor saying, it wasn't pull yourself together, it was...
you're a bit down in the dumps.
You're a bit down in the dumps.
Yeah.
I mean, astonishingly unhelpful. So you said that you worked, you decided you had to solve it. And obviously you didn't solve it. This is not pot noodle. You don't just add hot water and there's the instant solution. So what are the sort of things you did to get out of that?
So I read loads of books, and one of the things that came across really strongly was about being intentional. So being intentional rather than drifting. And I realized that I was drifting.
And what do you mean by intentional and drifting? Because they feel like really important words here.
Drifting in as much as I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing, and being intentional and starting to think about why I'm doing what I'm doing. So when I went back to work, I said to my boss that I didn't want to do it anymore. And she rightly said, "What is it you do want to do?" And I didn't know. And I think that's one of those things where if you've got someone who can hold the mirror up and just challenge you on some of your assumptions, that's a really helpful thing. So she took me through an exercise of writing down all the things that I did want. So I wanted to be present as a father. I quite wanted to earn more money. I wanted to have more free time. All these things aren't necessarily compatible. And she told me rightly I couldn't have it all. So what were the things I was prepared not to have in order to turn the dial up on the things that I did want? Because achieving a few of the things that I did want, or having better balance in those things, was better than having nothing of any of it. And And that really reinforced that kind of intentional thinking and that intentional approach to start to take a bit more control of things.
And do you remember what it was you felt you did value and that you would prioritize?
Definitely time around family, time around friends. It was really important to me that I felt that the work I was doing had a tangible impact, which is kind of partly what led me to joining CIPD in the end, is feeling that the work I was doing could have a tangible impact. And starting to look at some of those values that tie around that. So what is it I'm doing? How do I get value from that? How do I add value to other people from doing that? And what are the things that support that? So in the same way that if you're looking at a business or you're running a business, you'll look at the things that take you closer to your goals, and you'll prioritize the things that take you to your goals. You'll make that regular decision. Does this get me towards does this help me perform in the way I need to get to where I need to go? Approaching my mental health and kind of my personal life alongside that. So prioritizing the person as much as the profession.
Did that mean that your professional life became less important to you?
No, I would say it amplified the bits of my professional life that I got value from, and also where I could add value. So I would say, from a career perspective, things have only gone upwards since then, because I've been more focused on the things I can do that I can add value, as opposed to trying to do everything for everybody all the time. So rather than looking at a problem and saying I can do that, therefore I will do it, it's more thinking, what's the opportunity cost of me doing that, both for the organisation as well as for me. So being more selective and, again, intentional around where I put my focus.
That's fantastic. So interesting that the need, the absolute need to focus on what mattered, directly correlates with you making better decisions and becoming more successful. And the measure of success is more defined and more clear, so you're able to understand what success is, rather than somebody else's arbitrary measure of success, which could be a salary or a promotion or something else. So you've defined what success is, and because you've defined an outcome, you're able then to focus on delivering that outcome. And that outcome is not necessarily what everyone else would conventionally see as success. Fascinating.
In a good way.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, that was implied. I should have made it explicit. I meant conventionally in the sense of promotion, pay rise, bigger house, more things, more, successful kids, whatever successful is, perceived by others as being, external factors rather than internal, extrinsic success rather than intrinsic success.
Yeah, I think, just to clarify as well, I don't want to sound like I've got it all sorted and I've got all the answers, because I still very much haven't. And I would say my team and my colleagues would probably say there's been a couple of times this year where they've told me I need to just take a step back and just refocus myself a little bit. And I've still been pushing myself, and I've actually had to feel for myself that I need to take a step back. I've not taken that advice. So I'm still learning, still going through that process of correcting myself on a regular basis.
Great share. And you mentioned that over the next couple of years, or after this breakdown you'd had over the next couple of years, you continued to notice behaviors you were triggered, I think you said, at times. So this isn't, here's the answer, I'm fixed, everything's rosy, is it? This is a work in progress, always.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. So my current thing is, and I might not articulate this amazingly, but my current thing is trying to be really self-aware of what behaviors I've got that are running away from something, what behaviors I've got that are running to something, and then how to apply those behaviors healthfully. And that comes again into some of those things that led to that breakdown in the first place. So in that interest of vulnerable sharing, one of the things that really gets my stress triggers going is if I feel someone's challenging my professional competency. So I'll sometimes overcompensate. If I think I'm going into an environment where that might take place, I'll hugely overcompensate in my preparation, in my thinking, in my planning, in a way that probably isn't mentally healthy, just to avoid that particular challenge. So now I try and reframe it as so that's running away from something. So I'm trying to reframe it as it moving towards something looking at it as that learning experience and how I can engage with that moment as a learning experience as opposed to a challenge experience, basically.
So running towards something for you is a positive thing.
As long as it's towards that those bigger goals for myself,
towards your bigger goals. Yeah. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you're running to embrace it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because you can see it will do good and serve you and serve the causes that matter to you.
Yeah.
Rather than hiding.
Yeah. And rather than try and overcompensate to avoid it.
Yeah. So you said you mentioned stress triggers. Stress triggers, you said, rather than triggered, actually, which is even better, even more useful. When you were talking just now, I was thinking, this is a man that's like all of us has habits. It sounded to me like you were describing having to deal with habits or compensate for your habitual behavior. And I think a lot of emotional overdraft, we talk about the 10 drivers, and you filled in the waving around here, your self-assessment. There are sort of 10 drivers or behaviors that underpin emotional overdraft that my research has identified them. There could be more. And they are effectively habitual behavior, I think, broadly. And we do them without thinking. We do them for some reason, that either because it's the way we've always done it, or because of the way we're wired, or stuff that's happened to us in the past, and so on. So it sounds to me like you're still wrestling with habits. I was thinking this is a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So forgive me if this is a stupid question, but if you know what your objectives are, what you value, and if you know the behaviors that haven't served you in the past, how come you're still having to be on high alert?
So it's not a stupid question at all. I think sometimes sometimes there can be the distance or incongruence between the way we want to present and the things that serve us well, but also understanding the things that serve us well in different contexts. So for example, one of the things that went wrong on that project that caused the breakdown was me actually trying to be really helpful with customer service, and to do the right thing actually turned out to be completely not what the customer wanted in that moment. And I use that as an example because I think sometimes now I can be driven to want to do the right thing in a responsive way for someone, and that's right thing in inverted commas, which isn't necessarily going to be the right thing for me, or not necessarily even the right thing for them. So even now, I will look at my number of emails I get, number of WhatsApp messages, number of people contact me on LinkedIn, and I'll feel an urge to respond to some of those people where me responding probably won't add much value to them, definitely won't add value to me. But there's that almost duty-bound response to think, or almost in that customer first way of someone, even though they're not customers, someone has contacted me and they've asked a question, I can answer it, therefore I should. Yeah, absolutely. So it's still fighting that habit, and it's why, it's why I limit my interaction on social media, basically football forums aside, because otherwise it just again becomes overwhelming if I look at the number of messages I'm getting. I've locked my Twitter account there, but the number of Twitter DMs I get, like say LinkedIn messages, WhatsApp messages, emails, emails to work, personal emails, text messages, and it just becomes overwhelming to try and keep on top of absolutely everything. But again, that's me managing.
Particularly if your habit is to feel that you should be responding, empty inbox, immediate reply.
Absolutely.
And that you're failing them or you or something in the universe if you don't.
Absolutely that. Yeah. And that feeling that pressure to respond when I look at however many unread messages there are. So my way of managing that habit is effectively to avoid it by closing down my access to those things, which again may not be the healthiest way, but it works for me.
I think I don't think there's anything unhealthy about that. That's about finding a way to contain the damaging and unhelpful things in your life, isn't it? It's not, I don't think that's a bad habit. I think that's a good thing to do. And thank you so much for sharing all this, by the way. This is I know that people listening are going, Andy, ask this question. And if you do have questions, lovely, lovely listeners, then let me know, and we can follow up. But I heard when you were talking just now that I'm also conscious that you're a member of the British Psychological Society and a very senior person at the CIPD. And so, I'm talking to an expert, and all I did was do a bit of research and write a little book. So I'm conscious of that too. But when you were talking then, it sounded to me like you still create, well, we all do it all the time, but you're creating stories in your own head. We all live, our experience is entirely created in our own thinking, which is it's a very straightforward concept, but a very difficult concept to grasp, I think. I think lots of people still believe that it's outside in, that, they made me cross, this thing made me happy. We create our own thinking. And you obviously create thinking about what the person would feel if you didn't respond to their DM, or if you didn't respond to their email quickly enough. So how do you manage that? How do you, other than simply going, well, I'm going to manage the number of platforms I have and contain that? What do you do when do you hear that inner voice and that thinking happening, or are you on the alert for it, or what's your tactic for that?
So I hear that inner voice all the time. And right down to, yeah. So I mean, I hear that inner voice all the time. And it's so, as part of that containment, so I will check my messages, but I'll do it in a structured way. So I'll say every Friday, for example, I'll go through LinkedIn and I'll reply to all my messages, which means that by Sunday evening, that voice is already going, that there are messages there, and I've seen the alert pop up my messages, and I'm ignoring them, and I know I'm ignoring them. So I've understood my inner voice has a name. I won't say the name, because if anyone listens with that name, they'll be offended. But I've named it, basically.
Great.
So I've named it, and I just said it to shut up. So I just park it to one side. And I mean, I've got massive imposter syndrome talking about all this now, and I get imposter syndrome when I'm at conferences and I'm on the panel or whatever. But again, that imposter syndrome, that voice that tells me I'm not the right person to be talking about it, or I don't deserve to be there, it's all that same named individual voice. So I just, I know it's not me, it's the thing that's trying to bring me down. So I compartmentalize it and move it to the side.
I'm trying to think of the exact name of the book. There's a book about the inner gremlin. It might be called The Gremlin. And it sounds very like what the exercise you've gone through is to identify your gremlin, name it, and then you're conscious of it and you call it out. It's I will put it in the notes. It's a really good short book. And apologies for not remembering what it is. And by the way, you are the expert in Steve, and you are the absolute expert in these stories of sharing. So imposter syndrome, be damned. It's you're fabulous at this. Is it an effort to constantly be aware of that gremlin, to have that inner dialogue, to have that conversation, or is it something you become more relaxed? There's a fantastic song by a guy called Ren. I don't know if you've heard of Ren. Hi Ren, that incredible video, which I'd recommend to anybody. And he's talking to himself, and he's got a very negative side. And I think he obviously wrestles with that voice a lot, and it's physically very demanding. And I wonder how much effort you have to put in to do that, or do you? Sorry, Ren. My thought Ren was, maybe we edit this, but he was talking about dancing and how he dances. He was clumsy. The dance he had with his other self was he was stiff, and it was clumsy, and it was difficult. And the more he relaxed and the more he matured and knew himself better, the easier the dance became, and the more natural the dance became. And I wonder, what's your dance like with this gremlin of yours?
I think it's something that's become more normal and natural, I would say, as I've become more practiced at it. So initially I had to be really aware of it and dismiss it, whereas now it just feels more like an annoying niggle when it comes up. But back to what I was saying earlier around those situations, which are the stress triggers, and I use stress in that context in the negative stress way, because not all stress is negative, as we know. I would say that's where the voice becomes particularly loud. So those negative stress triggers will amplify that negative monologue voice.
So the voice gets louder, more intrusive, more demanding.
Yeah.
More believable.
More believable. So then I have to prove it wrong.
So then you're having to work harder to do that, and therefore more distracting, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And harder. Yeah. So in your notes to me, you mentioned another incident later on. Do you want to share that as well, or
no? Yeah, sure. So if I'm honest, I can't remember what incident it was, but
this was to do with your father.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I thought.
Are you sure you're happy to?
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Oh, thank you.
So
sorry. The reason I'm asking that is because I don't want anyone to leave this conversation, listening to this conversation, thinking, "Oh, okay, so I need to identify my gremlin, and then it's I kind of get used to it and relax into the dance, and I'm sorted." We are very hardwired, and habits are really hard to break, and life piles in and shits on us sometimes, and resensitizes us to all these things. And I just thought it was so interesting that you went and it bubbled back up again. That was why I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, so that's a good way of phrasing it, with being resensitized. So this is nearly 5 years ago, actually. Well, in fact, just over 5 years ago. So my father was terminally ill, and I was juggling work alongside family commitments, going to visit him in hospitals as much as I could in the evening, keeping my mum company, just the kind of general stuff that goes on in life, which sadly happens to all of us at some point. Alongside work were very understanding, really supportive during this time. And then my father passed away, and I found that I was feeling very much the obligation to support as many people as I possibly could with what they were going through, which in hindsight was partly my coping mechanism to avoid dealing with my own emotions and what I was going through myself. And I went back to work far too soon. So I think after 4 days or something, I went back to work. We were going through a bit of a mini transformation in that stage as well. So it wasn't going back to as supportive as everyone was. It wasn't going back to a really easy, comfortable environment. It was going back into quite a stressful environment. But as I do, I just said, I'm fine. I can deal with it, and I can manage it. It's helpful to be here. All the things that we convince ourselves otherwise. And after a couple of weeks, I realised again that I really wasn't doing well. One of the things for me, I think, around mental health is that I always had this idea that you kind of reach a cliff edge and fall off. But in my own personal experiences, it's more of a gradual decline. And that's what happened. It was accelerated, but it was still gradual. And I went from convincing myself I was all right to avoiding going home, basically. So I'd go and sit in the cinema for a couple of hours just to avoid people and sit in a dark room and not have to talk to anyone. And weirdly, didn't think there was anything particularly odd in doing that. It was just how I was getting through that particular time. Was I needed time on my own. The only way, literally, to get time on my own was to go and sit in the cinema. So that's
literally sitting in the dark.
Literally sitting in the dark. Yeah. So that's what I did. And again, I kind of applied that problem-solving approach to what I was going through, and decided that I just needed to take control. So the things I could take control of were really the only thing that I was responsible for, which was my health. So I gave up drinking, got a bit obsessive about sport. So I think there's potentially some link between addictive behaviours and working too hard and exercising too hard. And I just went that other way and completely threw myself into getting as fit as I possibly could. Like I say, gave up drinking, just took control of everything I could take control of because it was within my gift, while everything else around me seemed a bit chaotic. Yeah, and it was a crazy few months over that period where my daughter started a new secondary school where she only knew one other person and had all the challenges with adjusting to that. We had a burst pipe in the house that flooded the downfall of the entire downstairs. Car breakdowns, and we went into lockdown after 3 months. So yeah, a really, really chaotic time. And I don't know where I would be if I hadn't decided that I needed to take control. But definitely resensitized by that feeling of obligation to be there for everybody else as a way of avoiding dealing with things myself.
I'm really sorry to hear that. It's a tough listen, but also it's a really common story. Everyone has their flavor of that, I think, and it's a combination of things coming along, some big, some small, but the sort of rolled up consequence, the sort of aggregated consequence of those things pushes you to the point where everything's just too hard is interesting. And again, your answer was to take control. Steve had the answer. Who do you lean on to help you?
Again, it's slightly driven by context, I guess. So I've got my family, I've got good friends. There's there's one particular friend we meet up weekly and we play snooker, play tennis, do something, and that's again one of those habits that's become a really important part of just keeping grounded and we lean on each other in a really healthy way, I think. And at work, I would say I've got a really good relationship with my colleagues and my team to enable that leaning. And I mean, I'm hoping they might listen to this. I don't think anything I've shared will be of any surprise to them at all, because I try to create a space where we can be open and vulnerable with each other, but also have that holding the mirror up and being able to say to each other, "You've told me that if I spot X, Y, and Z, to let you know." And we do that for each other, and we look out for each other in that way. So very much that, but also being really open with them about the things I do that might be, so I was going to say slightly odd, but I don't know if they are, but you possibly unique to me, but which aren't necessarily anything for them to worry about. So my brain doesn't filter different inputs tremendously effectively in a way that is can be really, really good. So trying to think of a way to describe it. But if there's 10 conversations in a room, my brain will try and follow all 10 simultaneously. It can't filter out a specific individual voice or specific conversation, which is where it's not so great. Where it is good is really good for spotting patterns in data, for example, because you're receiving loads of information simultaneously. There's studies that have been shown it's great for empathy, for reading social situations, because you're picking up all that information. So my team know that if we've got a day in the office and we're in a meeting room for 4 hours, at the end of that 4 hours, my brain's absolutely fried. So if they all go for lunch together, I need 20 minutes on my own somewhere just to let my brain destimulate a bit and I can join them again. So it's making sure that they're aware of those kind of things which I need to do just to support me, to support them and be the best I can possibly be for them. So there's leaning that's I need help and asking, and there's the leaning that's just being honest with people so they know what to expect, and when to call you out on stuff and when to raise stuff and when just to let you be you.
I love this idea of having a language that you can use or labels that, I mean, that's where my idea came, the emotional overdraft came from, was I felt it was a complicated and hard thing to explain, but if we could label it, it was a shorthand for a lot of complexity. I guess it's like brands probably, but I like this idea that you have labels or shorthand that you can use with your team or your team can use with you. So sounds to me like if you're slipping back into those habits, or if you've been in a situation that they can recognize, they can go, okay, we need to give Steve a bit of space here. We need to, he's not being rude. He's not there thinking, isn't starting to create their own stories about that and take it personally. You've given them permission and you've explained why. So there's a sort of comprehension almost of which feeds on itself in much the same way that an overdraft feeds on itself. I think when you flip it the other way, those behaviors become very replicable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's very much a two-way thing throughout the team. So it's really important to me to create that environment where people have that psychological safety to feel that they can express themselves. And it creates a really good supportive environment that just helps us all be ourselves, but also bring the best out of people because they feel like they can share and be understood as well.
So when you say you hold the mirror up and you encourage them to hold the mirror up, what do you mean by that? Can you be a bit more specific? Because I think people are hearing that and going, I get it. And they might go away afterwards and go, well, what did you mean?
So, if I go back to my old boss, who took me through that exercise of what you prepared not to have in order to turn the dial up on the things that you have got.
Great exercise.
She very much held the mirror up and said, basically, you want to do absolutely everything and you're not achieving nothing, but you're only achieving a small fraction. You need to be realistic. You need to stop. I'm being stupid, wasn't the word she used, but you need to just kind of start to take a bit more responsibility towards driving the things that you want to get, rather than putting too much energy into things that matter. Yeah, things that will ultimately matter less or be less achievable. So that's what I mean by holding the mirror up. So it's forcing you to actually look at and confront the things that are not helpful to you or potentially holding you back. But also to recognize the strengths that you've got and the areas where you can add value, the areas where you are doing really, really well. So I think one of the things with self-awareness is that we can quite often think about self-awareness as being highlighting the things we struggle with or the things that we're not happy with. But self-awareness is also as much about seeing yourself as other people see you in all the positive ways and more challenging ways. And holding the mirror up is part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. God, I got so many questions. You talked about allowing your team to be vulnerable, and you're being extremely vulnerable here. I think you'll be prepared to be vulnerable, but by sharing this with us as well, for which we're very grateful. But I wrote down here, vulnerable but. And when I talk about it all the time, obviously it's my topic. And I hear leaders and managers and people who run teams and even maybe families and friend groups talk about, we need to be able to be vulnerable with each other and to be authentic. But when the pressure comes on and when the deadlines start piling up and when budgets get thin and when stuff gets tough, what happens then? How do you continue to allow people to be vulnerable without it feeling like it's drawing more than its fair share?
Do you mean drawing more than its fair share in terms of that getting in the way of doing the work, or?
Yes, I mean I'm caricaturing it. I'm fully on side with this, but I speak to lots of managers and leaders and founders and entrepreneurs who would go, yeah, it's great, but, and there's always this but hanging, and I can hear it even when they don't say it. It's fine when everything's good, but what do we do when actually we're properly under pressure? This stuff kind of has to wait. What do we do then?
I think that's seeing vulnerability as almost segmented from who a person is, and I think if you created that environment where vulnerability is acceptable, then you create space for really honest, open conversations, which aren't necessarily positive or I don't know, that's probably not the right phrase to use. So some of those open conversations might be challenging and they might be difficult for people to hear. But if you've created that space where people are being comfortable to be vulnerable, you've also created an environment where people can receive some of those more challenging messages when you're under pressure. You've also created an environment where people don't mind saying, I've messed up, or this has gone wrong, or I don't know how to do this. Can you come and help? So you've created that environment that actually supports you through those pressurized situations, I think. So I don't want to wrongly represent the work, but there's a fantastic writer, Margaret Heffernan, who's done TED Talks as well around things like social capital and how we create that social capital within our teams by creating those environments of trust. And teams that have that trust and that social capital far more resilient and far more able to deal with pressure and get through those pressurized situations, including situations where there might be conflict in the team, the ones where you avoid that because it's not comfortable to have it, or because you're worried that it might be unprofessional to have conversations about things like how something might be affecting your mental health or your well-being. So yeah, I think it's all part of creating an environment where you encourage honest, open, candid feedback all comes into that same piece.
So vulnerability is not just personal vulnerability. It's professional vulnerability. It is authenticity. And it's being able to say what you're thinking and being able to hear what people are thinking. So it's a collective exercise rather than an individual exercise, really, in a team. Of course it is in a way, but it's, are we prepared to say the things we have to say, need to say? And they might be, I'm feeling a particular way about something, or they might be, this is how I feel you are, this is how I'm feeling the impact of your behavior, perhaps. If it comes from a genuine place.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it creates permission to challenge on decisions as well, and understand the rationale, or, you know, if appropriate, suggest alternatives that might be better ways of doing things. And it all creates that environment of
trust. You said earlier, it's trust, isn't it? It is trust. And we talk about it very glibly, and there's lots of people who think they have trust, I think, in their teams. But when the pressure's on, we really find out, don't we? You stress test something almost. That's an engineering term, isn't it? If you stress test something, you prime the pump and see if it can handle the pressure. So when dear listeners, you are, I've gone all Bridgerton, haven't I? What happened there, dear listener? When you hear yourself agreeing with this, but going, but, and you hear your own but, not your own but, goodness, what am I talking about? But if you hear yourself hesitating over it, it's probably a pretty good clue that you're not yet at the point of trust you need to be at. If you're thinking, Steve's making sense, but it probably is a very big sign. There's a big red flag saying that there's more to be done. There's more to be done. Because if your team can't handle it when the pressure's on, that's the time it matters. We can all do it when the pressure's off. It's really important, Steve. Thank you. I wrote down a slightly strange thing here. I wrote down, I don't know what you said that made me think of it. When you meet someone, what do you say? When you meet or greet someone, what do you say to them?
In what context?
First thing in the morning, or
normally how are you doing? And so sometimes I'll position it and I'll say that's an intentional how are you doing, and I actually want to hear what you say. I'm not saying it's a polite thing to say. So yeah,
I knew you'd say that. I knew you'd say that. And this was not a setup, because so many people go, "Are you okay?" or "You're okay?" And people go, "Yeah, I'm okay." You don't set up. You don't greet someone and expect an answer with that. That means hello, really, doesn't it? I knew you would say something more significant than that. And how are you doing is a great question, because you genuinely want to hear what the answer is. And I imagine, do you say to people, if they go okay, do you sometimes, if you feel it's the right thing to do you?
Absolutely, yeah. And then if they respond, they don't say how they're doing, then I'll point out the fact that I've noticed the fact they haven't said how they're doing. And sometimes that will encourage a more honest response. And sometimes they'll say, because I'm too busy to tell you, but I'm okay. Right. If they don't respond to the how are you doing bit, I'll always pick it up.
And the reason I asked that was because I think people who understand that they have a gremlin, unnamed in your case, or named but not shared and don't, are very conscious of this, are very conscious of the sort of glib way we can use language sometimes, and also the carelessness of it. And so maybe it's an empath thing as well, but I love that you do that. It's something I do, and I just had a feeling that might be in you, and to really give a shit about the reply.
And the other thing, which I do it with my daughter as much as anything, is give people the right to vent if that's what they want to do. And sometimes say, yeah, are you telling me this because you want me to come up with the solution because you want to vent, or are you telling me because you want me to support you with your decision or validate what you want to do? So understand why people are telling you stuff as well. It's also helpful.
There's lots of, oh gosh, and forgive me again, I'll stick it in the notes. There's a brilliant book about feedback and the author, it's a lady, talks about the 3 types of feedback. And I love this idea. People either want validation, or they want coaching, or they want some sort of quantitative feedback. They want, I'd have expected more of you, or that was very good presentation, in the top 10%, or, people want numbers. And quite often we just think all these books about radical candor and things like that, I read them and I think they've got lots to say and there's lots of value in them. But I also think sometimes people don't need that feedback. Sometimes people simply need someone to say, you did the absolute best. Thank you. You did the absolute best. You did your best there. That was great. Maybe the next day is the day you give them some coaching, or you tell them how they might have done better, or but it feels like that a bit. It feels like, when's the moment we could carry on this conversation for a very long time, and we mustn't. We've overrun. We haven't even talked about your self-assessment, which I really wanted to talk about because he felt it sort of represented a lot of you, and there were a few questions in there we could have explored. But just to say, if anyone else fancies understanding where their emotional overdraft occurs, online at emotionaloverdraft.com, there's a little online self-assessment you can do, 50 questions. It doesn't take long, does it, Steve?
No, 5 minutes.
But it's fairly, would you say the results are fairly helpful?
Yeah, really helpful. It made me, I think I might have said to you, Andy, when I did it, I thought duty would be much higher than it was. And the fact it wasn't was part of that thing that I mentioned around what am I running away from and what am I running towards. So it just made me think slightly differently around some of the ways that, or some of the things I've assumed the motivations for behaviour. So yeah, I found it really helpful.
And absolutely, all the things you've been telling me today, I'm not surprised duty isn't a high driver for you. They're all, they're all interrelated, but I think you have a very, very healthy relationship with your sense of duty. There are some other, anyway, we won't get into it, but I'd really encourage people to have a go at it. It's useful and helpful. I hope. So the book is called Emotional Overdraft: 10 Simple Changes for Balancing Business Success and Wellbeing. And at the end, I always ask someone if they've got a simple change that they could share with us. And a caveat: this is simple, not always easy. So but do you have something you want to share with us, or?
So it comes back to holding the mirror up. So I would say find someone who you trust to hold the mirror up and tell you things that you might not necessarily love hearing, but need to hear. That will be really helpful for you. So find someone who can really show you how other people see you and help you develop and grow.
That's a really good share. Thank you, Steve. It's been brilliant talking to you. You've been incredibly generous for sharing your stories. I hope we can spread this far and wide. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Andy. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I wanted to say, I hope you enjoyed that. And I do hope you enjoyed that. But I also feel very moved after listening to that. I feel very touched that Steve shared those stories so openly. And afterwards, by the way, he said he's very happy for those to be shared as widely as we can because they need to be heard. So huge generosity from Steve there. So I don't know if it's something I should enjoy or we should have enjoyed listening to, but we can appreciate it. Perhaps I hope you appreciated it. And as I mentioned in the podcast, it's one of those, as ever with these, it's worth listening again and digging some of the interesting, what worked for you, digging that out. A couple of things I just wanted to pick up on, which I think we did, so I'll do it quickly this time. Right near the start, we talked about owning up to the fact that you're struggling. And it sounds a bit judgmental, but it's what Steve said, that we should be owning up to the fact that we're struggling. And I think he means we're owning up to ourselves, recognizing that that's what we're doing and that's what we're dealing with, and then doing something about it. And Steve shared loads of ideas for that, and I won't repeat all of those. But I think a really important message that came out of that was to recognize that you're struggling and then get the help, lean in. Don't own the fact that other people He talked about other people's workloads. Don't feel you have to own that as well as your own challenges. That's not your responsibility. You aren't helping. What's the expression? If, put on in the planes, if in case of an accident, the masks will drop, the oxygen mask will drop, put your mask on first. I think that's one of those examples of put your mask on first, and then you can be of more use to everybody else. So that, I thought that was a really important, and I'm definitely going to reflect on that some more. And the other one was one we did talk about a fair bit, which is holding up the mirror. It's a metaphor that's used a lot, but I really liked the idea of holding up the mirror and finding someone who can hold the mirror up and help you see how others see you, for good and for bad, for in the positive ways and in the less positive ways. And we all need to find those people. And Steve mentioned his friend who he sees on a weekly basis to play sports, and that's a great way of doing it. But there's also, we can get into the habit of with our friends of hiding what we're thinking and hiding what we're feeling, and putting up a front that we want people to see that we're successful or happy or not struggling. So holding up the mirror is quite a deliberate thing. We need to go and find those people, and we need to ask them to help us. So I guess it goes back to the vulnerability point. But really recognizing that the way other people see us is never the way we see ourselves. And that then becomes incredibly valuable to us. So I hope you found that useful, interesting, diverting, helpful, practical, touching, as I did. And please, subscribe, listen, share the podcast, talk to people about emotional overdraft. And I hope you feel great until the next time we speak.